Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. This is a recent reads video. Recent reads videos are a regular feature on this channel in which I discuss the books that I have most recently finished reading. I try to group them in threes, so the three most recent books, but this time there will be four, so the video may go over long. Simply because I finished the last two of the four within like 5 hours of each other. There was no reason to cut it at three and then withhold the other till the next video, although I could see a good argument for that also. And it will also go over long because I want to read some passages from one of those books which I read. Joshua Slocum's Sailing Alone Around the World. I have numerous passages picked out. During the course of reading it, I've had so many different thoughts, and probably more thoughts than I can comfortably recall. I have not taken the time to produce an outline, so I may touch on some of these things and may miss some of these things. So, the books which I have read since my last Recent Reads video, and I should mention that I am putting Recent Reads videos into a playlist, so you can hunt for the other Recent Reads videos in the sequence there. But since the last Recent Reads video, I finished Sailing Alone Around the World by Joshua Slocum on July 23rd. I finished The White Rajahs by Stephen Runciman on July 11th, The Eastern Schism by Stephen Runciman on July 17th, and then The Traitor's Niche by Ismail Kadare on July 24th. So I finished Slocum and Kadare, if that's how you say Kadare's name, most recently, and the two Runciman books I finished earlier, though I started the Slocum first. It's been interesting because my reading for this year is taking a turn which was unexpected. Earlier I read, and I wonder if I have, let me just take a quick look at what I've been reading this year. Well, nautical books are becoming a theme. So earlier I read America, about an immigrant lad coming to America. The entire first chapter, which serves as a standalone story as well, The Stoker, takes place in its entirety on board of the steamship wherein he made his passage. And then after that, just by chance, I jumped into B. Traven's The Death Ship, which is a novel, but obviously based upon real experience. The narrator, and basically you follow one narrator throughout, is working on a ship that is barely held together. And at one point, he is even shanghaied on another ship, which is going to be purposely sunk in order to collect the insurance. At the same time as this, I have been reading The History of the United States by Henry Adams, and so much of the dealings in the international political scene has involved impressment of sailors and also conflicts, all of the trading oppositions amongst the great powers, England, of course, and the U.S. But there have been different altercations between British and American warships, that sort of thing. Where I'm at now, the War of 1812 is just about to start, but that's just reinforcing the nautical theme. I read this, probably the first slave narrative that went over in a big way. And his enslavement did not fit the stereotypical mold, which largely came after in different books, in that a lot of his servitude, his enforced servitude, was spent as a sailor. So I think it was because of that that I decided for my next book, well, I did not say I will read Slocum. I said I will read either Slocum or Dana, 2 years before the Mast, whichever book I can find first. Well, I found this one first. And so it's the book of the four that I started first and finished last. I'm thinking of the four books, it's my least favorite. In many respects, I would say it's not a very good book. Let me read you a little bit from Slocum. The wind for a few days after passing Port Stevens, Seal Rocks, and Cape Hawk was light and dead ahead. But these points are photographed on my memory from the trial of beating round them some months before, when bound the other way. But now, with a good stock of books on board, I fell to reading day and night, leaving this pleasant occupation merely to trim the sails or tack or lie down and rest, while the spray nibbled at the miles. I tried to compare my state with that of old circumnavigators who sailed exactly over the route which I took from Cape Verde Islands or farther back to this point and beyond, but there was no comparison so far as I had got. Their hardships and romantic escapes, those of them who escaped death and worse sufferings, did not enter into my experience, sailing all alone around the world. For me is left to tell only of pleasant experiences, till finally my adventures are prosy and tame. This is an exact description of the book and of the failing of the book. It is essentially possibly one of the first major tourist books. He is sailing alone. He was the first to circumnavigate the globe by himself. But it fits the template of so many other sort of adventurers that we are familiar with. So, say somebody riding across the country on a bicycle, and they have a whole support team, and it's got a lot of publicity. He became something of a celebrity during the course of the endeavor, and he was relying upon all of the colonial activity which preceded him and went concurrently with him. Now, trading was getting away from sailing and going into steamships, and he had worked extensively sailing in trade, and as the field was changing and steamboats were becoming prominent, there was less use for sailboats, and he got his hand on, actually this is a photograph of the boat which he sailed around the world with. But then he was essentially going from a colonial port to colonial port. And as I say, about midway through the story, he's so well known, people expect him. At every port, he gives lectures. I assume people asked for his autograph and whatnot. The book reminds me very much of a book I read when I was very young, and so my memory is not clear, but it was The Old Patagonian Express by Paul Thoreau. Almost exactly the same as this book, except for the mode of transport. Thoreau was taking trains. This guy is sailing a ship. And he mentions that he was reading most of the time. He doesn't talk about what he was reading. Mostly he gives you his stops along the way because the sailing is by and large uneventful. And except for those few instances where it was eventful, as he himself indicates, quite boring. He did not even have to steer the ship most of the time. So he spends a lot of time with his relations with the people as he comes into port. In Samoa, I think he encounters the widow of Robert Louis Stevenson, the American writer. And it reminded me so much of in the Paul Thoreau book where he meets Jorge Luis Borges. So each book has its sort of writerly connection. It is while he is in Samoa that he gives his closest to interpretive thought about what he is doing and what is happening. So let me just read you a little passage from this. While the days go thus in these southern islands, we, talking about let me take it back. On the tree there is fruit. While the days go thus he's talking about how just everything comes easily to hand in the island life. While the days go thus in these southern islands, we at the north are struggling for the bare necessities of life. For food, the islanders have only to put out their hand and take what nature has provided for them. If they plant a banana tree, their only care afterward is to see that too many trees do not grow. They have great reason to love their country and to fear the white man's yoke, for once harnessed to the plow, their life would no longer be a poem. This is a very sort of stereotypical thought, a common thought, true though it may be. And his telling of it, or retelling of it, is uninspired, to say the least. He adds no nuance whatsoever, despite his first-hand experience. Once harnessed to the plow, their life would no longer be a poem. Now, the book, if I were to be reading this book as, say, the first book I ever read, I would not be real happy with it because it is pretty boring. But I am learning that the more you read and the more you can find connections in something you read with something else that you have read or learned about, the more invigorating and exciting the reading can become for you. And so I will read just a little section of where his book sort of impinges upon something else which I read recently. So, the Keeling Cocos Islands, according to, and when I first read this, I groaned because it just seems like your typical hack piece, putting some information gleaned from the encyclopedia to sort of set the stage for the little article for your reader's benefit. But it moves into other dimensions. The Keeling Cocos Islands, according to Admiral Fitzroy, RN, lie between the latitudes of 11 degrees 50 and 12 degrees 12 south. I'm not sure what's the right way to say that stuff. and the longitudes of 96 degrees 51 and 96:58 east. They were discovered in 1608, 1609 by Captain William Keeling, then in the service of the East India Company. The southern group consists of 7 or 8 islands and islets on the atoll, which is the skeleton of what someday, according to the history of coral reefs, will be a continuous island. North Keeling has no harbor, is seldom visited, and is of no importance. The South Keelings are a strange little world with a romantic history all their own. They have been visited occasionally by the floating spar of some hurricane-swept ship, or by a tree that has drifted all the way from Australia, or by an ill-starred ship cast away, and finally by man. Even a rock once drifted to Keeling, held fast among the roots of a tree. So this is really sort of tedious. If you have sailed, I think you might find a lot more of interest in the book. For a landlubber as myself, much less so. Let me continue. After the discovery of the islands by Captain Keeling, their first notable visitor was Captain John Clunies Ross, who in 1814 touched in the ship Borneo on a voyage to India. Captain Ross returned 2 years later with his wife and family and his mother-in-law, Mrs. Dymoke, and 8 sailor artisans to take possession of the islands, but found there already one Alexander Hare, who meanwhile had marked the little atoll as a sort of Eden for a seraglio of Malay women which he moved over from the coast of Africa. It was Ross's own brother, oddly enough, who freighted Hare and his crowd of women to the islands, not knowing of Captain John's plans to occupy the little world. And so Hare was there with his outfit, as if he had come to stay. So, I had previously encountered Alexander Hare in the book. Although I started this before I read The White Rajahs by Runciman, I finished this one very fast. So in the early chapters where he gives the history of Sarawak, which is the northern part of the island of Borneo, he mentions this man, this habit of Western men going and establishing their little seraglios, as Slocum calls it, was not really uncommon. So I liked making that connection. Slocum does not sail by Borneo. He's a little bit south in the Java complex. But I really enjoyed that connection. Now, Slocum is sailing at the end of the century, so 1897, I'm guessing he started, or 1896, something like that. He is about 10 years after the Berlin Conference, in which the European powers divvied up Africa. So you have a sense of this great colonialist expansion. And as I say, Slocum is relying upon this for his safety. Had this whole infrastructure of colonialism not existed, he could not have done what he did. And so at various ports and so forth, sometimes he is exempt from filling out paperwork, or he will find a benefactor to just pay his fees for him, and people will give him all kinds of provisions and that sort of thing. So it's very much the old colonialist mentality. When I was living in Taiwan as a young man, a bit of that still remained, and you would automatically look to another white fellow as sort of a brother and possibly look out for one another, that kind of thing. that said, let me finish off with a quote from Slocum with how he finishes off the story, which I think is quite lovely. An encouragement to other young men to go out on these kind of adventures. No one can know the pleasure of sailing free over the great oceans, save those who have had the experience. It is not necessary, in order to realize the utmost enjoyment of going around the globe, to sail alone. Yet for once and the first time there was a great deal of fun in it. My friend, the government expert and saltiest of salt sea captains, standing only yesterday on the deck of the Spray, that's the name of this ship, was convinced of her famous qualities, and he spoke enthusiastically of selling his farm on Cape Cod and putting to sea again. To young men contemplating a voyage, I would say go. The tales of rough usage are for the most part exaggerations, as also are the stories of sea danger. I had a fair schooling in the so-called hardships on the hard Western Ocean, and in the years there I do not remember having once been called out of my name. Such recollections have endeared the sea to me. I owe it further to the officers of all the ships I ever sailed in as a boy and man to say that not one ever lifted so much as a finger to me. I did not live among angels, but among men who could be roused. My wish was, though, to please the officers of my ship wherever I was, and so I got on. Dangers there are, to be sure, on the sea as well as on the land, but the intelligence and skill God gives to man reduce these to a minimum. And here comes in again the skillfully modeled ship worthy to sail the seas. To face the elements is, to be sure, no light matter when the sea is in its grandest mood. You must then know the sea, and know that you know it, and not forget that it was made to be sailed over. So this reminds me a little bit of the ending to the Joseph Conrad story, Youth. Ah, youth. But it is very much a tale of tourism. As I say, it reminds me of the person who decides to go cross-country in the U.S., say riding a bicycle, or I don't know, who was it? Will Kemp was going to hop on one leg backward from London to, I don't know, some other city. These kind of publicity generating enterprises. For all we know, there may have been intrepid solo travelers before Slocum. One will never know. But he had the big publicity machine. 1893 is when Swami Vivekananda was in Chicago, and I remember him saying that the British Empire was the greatest machine ever invented for the dissemination of ideas. So all of this is happening. Any solo traveler that antedates Slocum would not be heard of, but I would not doubt that such things occurred. It is just that Slocum had the publicity machine behind him. So the other book that I read a couple by Stephen Runciman, The White Rajahs, A History of Sarawak from 1841 to 1946. He precedes that with a good couple of chapters concerning, well, first the island and then the coming of the Europeans. And so you see again this whole movement. I think Slocum in that quote that I read mentioned something about the East India Company. All of these corporations were invented to extract what resources they could out of these islands. So here's a map from Runciman. Now Slocum was sailing down I think down here somewhere, so he never came into the same area. And in in the time of this book, at the upper part of Borneo and elsewhere, piracy was a great dilemma for the trading men, and gradually and systematically eradicated. I think in Slocum early on there's one little bit, possibly later there's a little bit of interaction between him and would-be pirates. He comes out on top of it. This story, well, I can't show you that. This story is just a really marvelous bit of history. Throughout my life, I've known about Christopher Columbus and all of the consequences from his landing in what he called the New World. And we were never taught about Vasco da Gama, or as I think you would say in Portugal, Vas da Gama, or something like that. And I would like to know more about Vas da Gama. But Runciman traces that. And it's a bit of an oddity in that, kind of like with King Leopold in the Congo Free State, this domain of Sarawak was largely the property of an individual. And there were 3 white Rajahs successively, Rajah James, Rajah Charles, and Rajah Minor. But it's a wonderful tale to know about. This book came out like in 1960, and simultaneously there was published another book by a different author. So I don't know the circumstances under which it was written, that two such books would come out almost simultaneously. I would like to see the other one, but have not decided to invest in it as yet. So that was the first book that I read by Runciman. And then I jumped into the next one, which was about the Eastern Schism. Now, Sarawak was not within Runciman's area of specialty. This most certainly was. I had read previous to that the Sicilian Vespers, and before that, the Fall of Constantinople. He was a great Byzantine scholar. And so I learned a lot about the discord between the Latin Church and the Eastern Church. And there is this word that you come across, the filioque. I don't know if that's how you say it, or filioque. And it pertains to how the Trinity is interpreted. And I'm not going to break it down. The question is how the Holy Spirit proceeds. Does it proceed from the Father, or from the Father and the Son? And Runciman explains that Greek was a different and much more subtle language than Latin. And so when the Latins came to that concept, they needed further clarification. And so they sort of unilaterally added those words. There is a Nicene Creed, I think, which was agreed upon by a huge council of churches. And subsequent to that, the Pope just added these words. And so Runciman sees the discord as being less what the words refer to, because he says the Eastern Church was always open to different views, that not everything has to be interpreted exactly the same way. But what they objected to was that a document which all of the main churches had agreed upon together could be changed single-handedly by one church official, I guess you would say, independent to any sort of consultation. And then, of course, the Latin church became domineering and wanted to dominate everybody else. And so that therein lies the basis for the discord. And I enjoyed that quite a bit. My goal is to read more Runciman, but when I finished this, I had finished these two, and I was still plodding along with Slocum, and I thought, let me withhold another Runciman for now, and I pulled out the Traitor's Niche, which Pete at Bookless Pete, a YouTube channel, had recommended, and I read it and enjoyed it quite a bit. Now, there is no maritime details in here, but the other theme which has sort of dotted my year so far has been the Emperor Napoleon. Napoleon figures extensively in Henry Adams's History of the United States during the administrations of Jefferson and Madison. He was in Tolstoy's War and Peace, which I started the year with. Slocum, one of his last stops, excuse me, is on the island St. Helena, I think, where Napoleon made his retirement. I think he said the estate which he visited, as any good tourist would, was the Longwood Estate, and I meant to look it up and I forgot, so I have not looked it up yet. Being able to check things out on Wikipedia is very helpful. Not in all cases have I been able to follow Slocum's travels on the map, because in some cases the names of places which he uses don't seem to exist now, and there is no trace of them as having existed except in his book, because you Google and you just come up with his book. So, and Napoleon is in here, and it is a really marvelous book. There was something I wanted to... There is a blurb on the back from the New York Times book review. The quest for a rebel pasha's severed head becomes a grimly comic commitment, ... in this brilliant and laconic 1978 Albanian novel and allegorical fable about 20th century authoritarianism. Throughout, I'm not sure how many chapters it is, but throughout the majority, seven or eight, it's very realistic in tone, and everybody talked about it as being Kafkaesque. I think I read some things that talked about it in such a way. Actually, while I was reading it, and particularly the first 6 chapters, felt to me more akin to Gogol, where what was presented was factually plausible, but told in such a way, perhaps slant, to just give it a little edge. So, as in that famous scene with Gogol, where the two men are trying to enter through the doorway and neither one can because each wants to defer to the other. Events were portrayed with a comical tone to them. But then by the last chapter, it's as though all holds, I'm not sure what the right phrase would be. The barring of any holds is off. It becomes more of a free-for-all. And so the little surrealistic elements that have dotted the narrative throughout come at you full force. And it is when they do that you realize that the story he is telling represents an allegory. For a totalitarian regime. It reminded me in many ways of life in the age of social media. And I put something in my community tab recently, and I did not think to pull it out. I would read it for you here. But needless to say, I really loved this. While I plodded through this story, as I say, it's kind of boring, and I'm not that interested in meeting the celebrities of the day, all of the various governors, all of the various adjuncts of these trading men that you encounter in a much more hard way in Runciman's history. I'm not interested in the superficial socializing, which a visitor such as Slocum would do with these people. But this, as opposed to it being a slow plod and a slow crawl, I just breezed through it, and I look forward to reading more by this author sometime soon. So, my upcoming reads, I tend to read 4 things at a time. So, at night before bed, I have been reading a Library of America edition. Lately, it has been The History of the United States by Henry Adams. Then I've been reading, I said I was going to read The Elements by Euclid. I read the first chapter quite some time back and have not touched it since, but I have not given up on it. It is still in my mind. Life has been a little bit hectic here. We have, if you've seen the video I did about our cats and other animals, we have one fewer than we had, and that entailed some difficult times. It remains to be seen whether we will replace that missing member of our little family. But so that has taken me from reading, and other events have conspired to rob me of the uninterrupted time that I would like. So then for my other 2 books that I am planning to go for, I showed you the one because I found it 2 years before the Mast. And as far as nautical stories, this is a memoir, as well as Slocum's was a memoir. If you watch my channel for any length of time, you know that I am not enthralled with memoirs. But already the writing of this is so much better than Slocum's. Slocum's is very pedestrian. He recounts his story from a lad of age 19, a couple of years, as he says, before the Mast, where he is transformed from a landlubber to a wizened sailor with his sea legs, let us say. And so he is going to great pains to explain to you what life on board a ship is like. I have not gotten very far. I've read a few chapters, but this really jibes well with this. I mean, the character in B. Traven's novel is in the worst of worst possible situations for a seafaring man. This not so much, but my understanding is that there will be some excruciating scenes forthcoming. So that is one thing that I am reading, and I have only just started another Runciman. This is The Great Church in Captivity. It's probably the biggest thing by Runciman I have. Both of these books are about 400 pages each, so it will be a while before I do another recent reads video, because I'm not going to be finishing any of these things anytime soon. But that is where I am at this point, and we will take it from there. I'm just trying to think if there were any concordances amongst these books that I wanted to draw attention to. Things come into my mind all the time, and as I say, I'm not a professional booktuber, and I am not jotting down notes. If one were, say, a book reviewer or something like that, one would jot down notes and try to remember this kind of stuff. Despite Slocum's encouragement for others to follow him in their adventuring, I just can't say enough that it really is a book about tourism. Nowadays, well, in fact, what was it? The one by Cy Montgomery. One little scene in it was where she goes and does some ecotourism. That's very popular. She goes off the coast of Mexico with a group, and a guide takes them to look at various octopuses and stuff like that. The mechanisms of tourism have changed, but the bones of the activity remain the same. Now, there used to be a popular booktuber named Grix, who had something of a peregrinaceous life, and he worked on shipboard at times, and he always posited a very important distinction between traveling and touring, or going as a tourist. I don't know that any real clear-cut distinction can be made. But to use his dichotomy, I have never traveled so much in those ways. I mean, possibly one could say in my early years in Asia, I was traveling more, but even then, I don't think so. I think it was just, as with Slocum, taking advantage of the ease with which travel was made possible for persons with the right passport, with the right backing, and with the right pedigree, with the right skin color, and so forth. I have done, subsequent to that, my share of being a tourist, and I do not mean to denigrate tourists or tourism. It has its place, and my life has been enriched by being a tourist, as in that first Paul Thoreau travel account that I recall reading, the Old Patagonian Express. It inspired me to see other places and so forth, but it is not the same as traveling or being a true bona fide adventurer. In that sense, even though the story of the White Rajahs are essentially dealing with these exploitative businessmen, their tale is more interesting than Slocum's, which is crossing the line from where adventure bleeds into sport, I think. And so his narrative reads much more like a sportsman's odyssey. As he himself admits, he encounters no great difficulties. There were one or two near misses, and no time spent either on sea or land is entirely without its potential danger. But in his book, he almost doesn't encounter any. So that is where I have been recently with reading. This is much longer than it should have been. Thank you very much for stopping by my channel.